My parents asked me for just a small loan for the ninth time in 6 years. The same week, I finally added up every transfer I'd sent them since I turned 25. The number on my screen was $61,400. I'd never once been paid back. This is still waters. Here's what she wrote. I'm Noelle, 32. My parents, Frank and Sheila, raised my brother and me on a tight budget, but a stable one. Nothing dramatic, no crisis I remember from childhood, just a normal working class household where money was managed carefully because there wasn't much slack in it. I moved out at 18, put myself through school with a mix of loans and a job at a call center. And by my late 20s, I had a stable career in logistics management, a decent salary, and, this part matters, a instinct, inherited straight from watching my parents, to help family when they asked. I think part of why I became the reflexive helper in the family traces back to a specific year, when I was 14, when Dad was between jobs for almost 5 months, and Mom picked up double shifts at the diner to cover the gap. I remember the particular quality of that stress in the house. Not loud, not dramatic, just a constant low hum of everyone being careful, of grocery trips getting shorter, of Christmas that year being smaller than usual without anyone explaining why. Nobody ever sat me down and told me money was the family's fragile point. I just absorbed it the way kids absorb things, and some part of me has been quietly trying to prevent a repeat of that year ever since, long after I had any real reason to believe it was still at risk. The first small loan came when I was 25. Dad's truck needed a transmission, $2,200, and he asked carefully, almost apologetically, promising to pay me back within 2 months once a work bonus came through. I didn't think twice. Family helps family. The bonus, it turned out, went to a different expense that came up first, and the $2,200 quietly became something neither of us mentioned again. My brother Desmond has never once been asked for money the way I have, something I noticed slowly over the years without fully naming it until much later. Part of that is circumstance. He's had a harder run financially himself, 2 kids, a mortgage that stretches him thin. But part of it, I think, is that my parents learned early which of their 2 children would say yes without much friction and adjusted who they asked accordingly. The pattern repeated every 8 or 9 months after that, always with a specific, reasonable-sounding emergency attached. A medical bill, a property tax payment that came due at an inconvenient time, once a security deposit for a rental after they'd fallen behind on their own mortgage. Each individual ask made sense in isolation. Each one came with a version of just this once, or we'll get you back as soon as. None of them ever were repaid. I never tracked the running total, because tracking it felt like keeping score against my own parents, which felt wrong on a level I couldn't quite articulate. There was a particular ask, 4 years in, that I still think about. My mother calling in tears, saying they were 3 days from a shutoff notice on the electric bill, needing $600 by end of day. I transferred it within the hour, no questions, the way you do for an actual emergency. It was only much later, cross-referencing old texts while building my spreadsheet, that I noticed the shutoff notice call had come 6 days after a Facebook photo of the 2 of them at a fairly nice restaurant for their anniversary. Neither fact disproved the other on its own. Together, they made me wonder how many of the emergencies over the years had really been emergencies, and how many had just been whichever bill happened to be least comfortable to cover that month. There was another pattern I didn't notice until I had the full spreadsheet in front of me. Nearly every ask arrived within a week or 2 of my own paycheck bumps, a raise, a bonus, once a small inheritance from a great aunt I'd barely known. I'd mentioned each of those developments casually, the way you mention good news to your parents, never once thinking of it as financial information they might be tracking. Looking at the dates lined up, it was hard to avoid the conclusion that they'd been listening more closely to my finances than I'd ever listened to theirs, adjusting the size and timing of each ask to roughly what they sensed I could currently absorb without much protest. I don't think that was calculated in the cold, deliberate way it sounds when I describe it now. I think it's more likely that good news about me register unconsciously as relief. A sense that things were a little less tight for me, which made asking feel a little more acceptable, a little less like taking from someone who genuinely couldn't spare it. That doesn't make the pattern less real. It just means nobody was sitting down plotting it out, which somehow made it both easier and harder to bring up honestly. What changed wasn't one dramatic ask. It was a Tuesday evening, doing my own taxes, when I needed to pull my bank transfer history for the year and found myself scrolling back further than I'd intended, past this year's transfers to my parents, into last year's, then the year before. I opened a spreadsheet almost as a distraction from the actual tax work and started logging every transfer I could find, going back to that first $2,200 for the truck. The number that came back, 7 years of transfers added together, was $61,400. Not evenly spaced. Some years closer to $4,000. One particularly hard year closer to $14,000. But real, documented, sitting in my own bank records the entire time, never once flagged as unusual, because each individual transfer had felt small and reasonable when I sent it. I sat with that number for almost a week before saying anything to anyone. What unsettled me most wasn't the total, exactly. I could have earned that money and simply not saved it, and the math would have felt the same either way. It was noticing, once I lined the transfers up against dates, that several of them came within weeks of my parents taking vacations, replacing a car that didn't need replacing, or covering costs for my brother's family that they'd apparently agreed to without checking whether they actually had the money first. I wasn't funding emergencies as consistently as I'd believed. I was funding a gap between what they earned and what they chose to spend. And I'd been quietly closing that gap for 7 years without either of us calling it what it was. I called my best friend, Priya, before I called anyone in my family, mostly to say the number out loud to another person and see if it sounded as large from outside my own head as it did inside it. It did. She'd known about individual loans over the years. I'd mentioned them in passing, the way you mention small annoyances, but she'd never heard them added up either. And her reaction, a long silence followed by, "Noelle, that's a car. That's more than a car," was the moment the abstract discomfort turned into something I actually had to act on. Priya asked me gently whether I'd ever considered that saying no to any single ask over the years might have felt, to me in the moment, like a bigger risk than losing the money. A risk to how my parents saw me, to the role I'd built for myself in the family as the reliable one, the one who always came through. I sat with that question longer than I expected to. I think she was right, more than I wanted to admit at first. Some part of me had been buying a kind of certainty about my place in the family with every transfer. A certainty I'd never once had to test by actually saying no and seeing what happened afterward. That conversation with Priya is part of why I didn't go to my parents angry, even once I had the full number in front of me. I went to them curious, in a strange way, about what would actually happen if I finally tested the thing I'd spent 7 years too afraid to test. whether the relationship could hold an honest boundary, or whether it had only ever worked because I never once pushed against its edges. I brought the spreadsheet to my parents on a Sunday, not as an ambush, but plainly. I told them a week in advance I wanted to talk about money, and showed up with actual numbers instead of a feeling. I watched my mother's face as she read the total, and I don't think she'd tracked it any more closely than I had. My father, quieter, asked if I was accusing them of manipulating me on purpose, which wasn't what I'd said, but told me something about how the request had always felt safe to make, precisely because I'd never once said no. I told them the truth as I understood it. I didn't think they'd set out to use me as a financial backstop. I think each individual ask had felt small enough, urgent enough, and rare enough in the moment that neither of us had ever added it up. But I had now, and I couldn't keep being an unplanned line item in a budget I wasn't part of building. My mother asked, quietly, whether this meant I resented Desmond too, for never being asked the way I had been. I told her it wasn't about Desmond at all. If anything, I felt for him, because being the child nobody thought to lean on can carry its own quiet message about how much they trust you with hard things. That answer seemed to land somewhere neither of them expected, and the conversation softened slightly after that, less defensive, more like the three of us actually looking at the same problem, instead of two of them bracing against an accusation. My father asked a harder question, one I hadn't fully prepared for. Whether I'd have ever brought any of this up if I hadn't happened to stumble onto the total while doing my taxes, or whether I would have just kept quietly funding the gap indefinitely. I told him the honest answer was that I didn't know, and that not knowing bothered me more than the number itself did. 7 years is a long time to not notice, or to notice and not say anything, and I wasn't sure which of those two things had actually been happening inside me the whole time. We sat with that question longer than any other part of the conversation, none of us rushing to fill the silence with something more comfortable. My mother eventually said she thought families like ours, ones that grew up genuinely tight on money, sometimes raise kids who mistake endless giving for love, and that she recognized the shape of that in me because she recognized it in herself first, toward her own parents, decades earlier. It was the first time either of them had connected what was happening between us to something bigger than just this one relationship, and it made the conversation feel less like an accusation and more like all three of us finally looking honestly at a pattern none of us had built on purpose. What we agreed to wasn't a demand for repayment. I told them plainly I wasn't expecting $61,400 back, and I meant it. That ship had sailed years ago in 100 small, forgivable ways. What I asked for instead was a real boundary going forward. No more loans without a written repayment date attached before any money moved, and if a repayment date passed without payment, the answer to any future ask would be no, not, we'll figure it out. My father resisted the writing it down part hardest, saying it felt cold between family, that paperwork somehow cheapens something that's supposed to run on trust. I told him trust was exactly what 7 years of unspoken transfers had quietly worn down, not built up, and that a repayment date in writing wasn't a lack of trust. It was the only thing that had ever actually been missing. They tested the new arrangement twice in the following year. Once, my mother asked for help with a car repair, gave a repayment date 3 weeks out, and paid it back on time. The first repayment I'd received in 7 years. The second time, my father asked without a date attached, catching himself halfway through the request, and said, almost surprised at himself, "Right, never mind. Let me figure out a date first before I ask." There was a third moment, harder than the first two, when my parents genuinely couldn't make a repayment date work. A real dip in income that year. And instead of quietly missing it the way they always had before, my father called me himself ahead of the deadline and asked for an extension, explaining exactly why and proposing a new date. It was such a small, ordinary thing to do, the kind of conversation any two adults might have about money. It had just never once happened between us before, in 32 years, until a spreadsheet forced the question into daylight. That same year, I found out my parents had started their own small savings account, specifically labeled, in my mother's handwriting on the passbook cover, in case of Noelle, not a large amount, a few $100s accumulated slowly, but a genuine attempt, unprompted by me, to become the kind of safety net for themselves that they'd previously only ever been able to lean on me for. My mother told me about it almost shyly, like she wasn't sure I'd believe it mattered, given how much smaller it was than anything I'd ever sent them. It mattered more to me than almost anything else that came out of that year. I don't send money without a date attached anymore, and for the first time since I was 25, that doesn't feel like withholding love. It feels like the actual shape help was supposed to have all along, before it quietly turned into something neither of us had agreed to out loud, back before either of us had a name for what it had become. Desmond and I talked about all of this for the first time honestly, about a year after I brought the spreadsheet to our parents. He admitted he'd sometimes resented what looked from the outside like me being the generous one, without ever seeing the actual pattern underneath it. The total, the repeated asks, the years it had gone unspoken. Once he understood the full shape of it, he stopped seeing my boundary as coldness and started seeing it as something closer to what it actually was. The first honest accounting either of us had ever gotten to see. He also told me, almost as an aside, that he'd once offered our parents a small loan himself, years earlier, and been turned down. They'd told him they were fine, just wanted to check in with Noelle first, about some unrelated expense that same week. Hearing that landed strangely. It wasn't that they'd preferred asking me exactly, I think, so much as that the path of least resistance had been worn so deep by then that it simply didn't occur to them to try a different route, even when one was quietly being offered. Now, when a family expense comes up, Desmond and I sometimes split the actual ask between us, evenly, without either parent needing to choose which child to approach first. A small, deliberate correction to 7 years of a pattern that had quietly decided, long before any of us noticed, which of their children carried the weight and which one got to stay clear of it entirely. I keep the original spreadsheet still, updated occasionally now, though it looks different than it did that first Tuesday. A column for repayments actually received, small as they are, sitting next to 7 years of numbers that will probably never be repaid, and that I've genuinely made peace with not chasing. The number itself stopped being the point a while ago. What mattered was finally seeing it clearly enough to decide, on purpose, what kind of daughter I actually wanted to keep being. So here's what I keep wondering. How many of us are running a spreadsheet we've never actually opened for people we'd never think to ask to pay us back? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.